What's up, Lost Boys? Here we are for another fantasy recap video. We are almost at the end of the year. We're almost done with fantasy football. We just finished the regular season, and what a regular season it was. We're going to get right into these games. Then we're going to do a quick little recap of each person's team this year. Then we're going to look at the two playoff matchups. So this one might be a tad bit longer, but stick with me. It should be a fun video. Let's go over the games real quick from this last week. But first, today is JC's birthday, boys. He's 10 years old today. He's still snoozing, or I'd bring him in front of the camera. So wish JC happy birthday. Happy thoughts for him as well. He's an old man. But anyway, we had some crazy games today, or this past week, guys. Some pretty much de facto playoff games and some high stakes games. We're going to start with the most important one, which was Pat versus Ryan. This was pretty much win and you're in, which is crazy to think in the last week, but it was an awesome game. Unfortunately, Pat's team waited till this week to have one of its worst weeks of the year. His guys just didn't show up. He put up less than 100 points. Ryan put up 133, not the best, but not that bad. It was okay. Pat clearly had a chance to beat him. Ryan got off to a really, really good start. He had mainly Sam Laporta on Saturday night, got him 26 points. Scary Terry had his best game of the year. But Ryan left the door open. His guys really didn't perform well. Pat's guys, the Jags, pretty much just couldn't get it done. Lawrence only had 14. ETN only had 7. Zay Jones, 8. I mean, you had to do a little bit better. And Devontae Smith. If those guys just had good games, Pat might have been able to take this one down. He was not able to, so he goes down. Ryan snags the dub and snags the playoff spot. The other one that was kind of a de facto playoff spot was Josh versus Jace. Jace, like we talked about, kind of already had a spot because his points were absolutely so much higher than everyone else. But Josh had to win this one, and boy, did he win this one. He beat Jace by over 100 points. I think it's our first 100-point victory this year. He more than doubled his points, which is absolutely crazy. Uh, Pretty much, Josh had all his guys do really, really well. Don't really need to go into that. Jace, on the other hand, had his guys not do really, really well. But either way, Josh makes it into the playoffs. Jace also, like we said, because of his points and his tiebreakers, makes it into the playoffs. So that game was that. Then you had a couple other games. If Tim beat Denny, or if Tim beat Justin and Josh would have lost, Tim had a really good shot to get in. Unfortunately, Tim's team fell off a cliff as well. 125 is not too bad. Justin actually won. He moved to 6-9, so Justin's team played pretty well. Took down Tim, and then you also had Denny versus Learning Computer. Learning Computer had to have a victory and had to have Josh lose. Um, and unfortunately, Learning Computer couldn't get the victory. Denny stepped it up. Denny's team kind of got some momentum at the end of the year and took down Learning Computer, so made the playoffs a little bit more clear, regardless of Josh's outcome. Either way, it didn't matter. Josh won, beat Jace. Once that game happened, playoffs were pretty much set. And then our last game, Cass versus Cal. Another game where Cal looked like he was going to take it, and Cass says, nah, 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 not yet. Mainly Christian McCaffrey says no. He scored him like 40 something points. He's been the best fantasy player of the year. He's been a rock star for Cass, carrying him into the playoffs. Cass wins again. He sits at first place at 11-4. So those were the quick recap of the games this week. Now, before I get into our playoff matchups, what I want to do is I want to look at each team real quick and do a summary of the season and what we thought of the teams. So, our standings, we'll talk about the top four. You had Cass number 1, Josh number 2, Llama number 3, Jace number 4. Those are the playoffs, and I'll get into those when we talk about the playoffs. So we're going to start at the bottom. We're going to start at the Turd Bowl. We got Cal. Cal had a really crappy year. He ends up the year 4-11, which is really bad. Least points scored, which is really bad. And he had like leaving the draft, you would have thought Cal's team was the safest of anyone, and there'd be no possible way that Cal was going to get last place. He had Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Waddle, Tony Pollard were his first 3 picks. all those guys you thought minimum were going to be at least like top 12 guys at their positions. Mahomes, you thought, top 5 easily. And unfortunately for Cal, those guys stayed healthy all year and they were mediocre all year. So he had to start them and they just didn't do very well. Then on top of that, he drafted Mark Andrews. He got hurt for the year. He replaced him with Evan Ingram later in the season, which was good. But he even had a good, first 8 weeks from Adam Thielen before he fell off a cliff. But his team just couldn't get gelled. He had Deshaun Watson, then he got hurt, then he was starting Bryce Young. His Dameon Pierce pick ended up being awful. He had Devin Singletary. A bright spot for him was Rachaad White. I think Rachaad White's going to end up being like running back 6 this year, which is really, really good. Great value for Cal. It just, because of those first 3 picks, because he could never replace them because they never got hurt, he just could never win any games. And he really couldn't score a lot of points. So Cal ends up at 130 points a week, 4-11. Sorry, Cal. You're getting renamed next year. Then Denny, 2 games ahead of Cal. He ends up 6-9. He won 2 in a row. He ended up beating Josh 2 weeks ago. Then he beat Tim last week. It's crazy. He was only a couple games out of the playoffs, which is wild considering how sour his season went. Mainly, Denny bet a lot on the Jets. He had Garrett Wilson. I think he had Aaron Rodgers, and he also had Dalvin Cook. And when that Rodgers, the first play of the game pretty much happened, that was a huge punch to the stomach for Denny. He ends up recovering. He gets Baker Mayfield. Baker ends up being awesome the second half of the season. But Denny kind of had a similar case as Cal. He drafted Najee Harris. He drafted Garrett Wilson. He drafted Jamar Chase. All 3 of those guys, for the most part, stayed healthy all year. And all 3 of those guys, minus a couple monster weeks from Chase, had mediocre seasons. And Denny had to start them, and they had to do whatever. And to be honest with you, some of those weeks, Lamar Jackson was one of those guys. Lamar, I thought, was going to be a monster this season. And he was okay a couple games, but the Ravens ran the ball a lot. Gus Edwards had like a 5-game stretch where he had like 12 rushing touchdowns or something. Lamar usually gets those. So Denny's team ends the year strong. He got Baker rolling at the end. Jackson Smith-Njigba was doing pretty good. Chuba Hubbard was doing good for him. But at the end of the day, like, his stars that he drafted were not stars, and they were just taking up a roster spot, and it really killed him early in the season. So it set him in a hole, and he wasn't able to climb out of it. But a good ending to the season. 8th place, we got Justin, 6-9. Same record as Denny, but got more points. Justin also ends the year on a win. Justin banked on the double quarterback draft at the end of the first round. Josh Allen, Joe Burrow. Well, we know how that went. Joe Burrow got hurt. And then at the beginning of the year, T. Higgins got hurt. So he never really had his Burrow to Higgins connection rolling. Justin luckily had multiple quarterbacks throughout the year. He got C.J. Stroud. He had Derek Carr. C.J. Stroud got hurt. He tried to make a trade in the middle of the year with Pat. I think it was like an Aaron Jones for a wide receiver. I can't even remember the wide receiver. Romeo Doubs and another guy. That was okay. It did all right for him. But the sad part about Justin is, once again, he left his draft and he just didn't have any depth, which was really frustrating for him because he had Raheem Mostert, which was one of the best draft picks of the year in fantasy football. Mostert had like over 20-something touchdowns this year. If he just would have drafted a little bit better, I mean, surprisingly, he had Courtland Sutton. He had Jacoby Myers, who had surprisingly good years. He had Mostert, but his flex spots were so bad all year that he could not overcome those games. And that's what probably caused Justin, along with the Burrow injury. Burrow injury really killed him. It was basically a first-round pick. Technically, it was his second pick, but still, when you lose a first-round pick, it's almost impossible to get into the playoffs, and you saw that this year with Justin. But still, 6-9 is not too bad. Next, Justin was 8th. We're going to 7. Tim, the ICU. Look at this guy. He's fighting for playoff spots. He's usually in the trash can by this time. He doesn't know what's going on. He thinks it's freaking summer by now. But his team was good. Brock Purdy, one of the best quarterbacks, maybe the hottest quarterback right now. Tua was a little up and down this year. He had a great fortunate pick with Jordan Addison because JJ got hurt. So Jordan Addison was a stud this year. Um, Tim's team in general, he had a lot of good players. Ramondre Stevenson, Brian Robinson, Josh Jacobs, Brees Hall, Zach Moss. The guy was loaded at running back, and he probably should have traded away a couple of these guys for wide receiver depth, specifically Brees Hall after he got rolling, um, or Brian Robinson when he had those first 3 or 4 weeks. He probably should have traded. But either way, his team was good. He had the number three, I think, right now, fantasy wide receiver this year, and AJ Brown, who was a monster, especially that 6, 7 week stretch. He was just unstoppable. Michael Pittman ended up being pretty good at the end of the year. But a big problem for Tim was his first round pick, Kelsey. Unfortunately, he was healthy majority of the year. He missed that first game, and then when he came back, he didn't really have much. Like he had good a couple weeks, but you expect a lot more from Kelsey, and he just did not get it because we talked about Mahomes before. The Chiefs' offense has been really, really bad, um, and that really killed Tim. I think if Kelsey had a normal year this year, Tim would be in the playoffs, which is crazy to think. But Kelsey, compared this year compared to other years, I mean that's just that much of a difference. So Tim had a huge successful year based on his normal standards. If he keeps that same momentum going forward, Tim could be pushing towards a playoff spot next year. We'll see. We will see. So that was Tim. He was seventh. Sixth place, Learning Computer. Super close to getting in. He needed the victory and a couple losses at the end of the season. He had decent points, 144 points per week. Uh, you know, Matt's team was interesting. But I mentioned Justin losing Burrow, and I mentioned Tim's first round pick of Kelsey not really doing it. Matt was in the same boat. He took Bijan, which was the sexy thing to do at draft season, and Bijan looked awesome, especially the first 8 weeks. But fortunately, he plays for a man named Arthur Smith, who is the worst. He's the fantasy killer, and Bijan had to be started, and he did bad almost every single week. And that sucks because the guy's really, really good. Unfortunately for Matt, he had some great gems. He got Keenan Allen later, and Keenan Allen was a rock star this year. Up until I think he got hurt, I think he was wide receiver 2 in the league, which is crazy. He also had the rookie of the year this year in Puka Nacua. He drafts Cooper Kupp, and he says, you know what, I'm going to take this guy's backup until he comes back healthy. Well, what happens to be the backup was better than Cooper Kupp. And then he started on both because they were both pretty good. So he had the Rams. Mentioning the Rams, Kyren Williams was really good when he was healthy. So Matt loads up on the Rams. His team looks really strong when the Rams looked really strong. Unfortunately, when the Rams did bad, his team did bad. His quarterbacks, that was his big downfall. I mean, he has Gardner Minshew, he has Sam Howell, he has Tommy DeVito on his team, Will Levis on his team. He loads up on these quarterbacks. He did have the Anthony Richardson injury, which was brutal. Gardner Minshew wasn't bad, and Sam Howell wasn't bad. I think Sam Howell might end the year as a top 10 quarterback, maybe top 12 quarterback, because they throw the ball a lot, but he really faded down the stretch. Um, Mike Evans had a good year. Matt's team was really good this year, but he had very few great weeks from his quarterbacks mixed in with his flex positions, and I think that's kind of what hurt Matt. It was a tough one though, because I think his team was really good. He did have, I think, like the second least points allowed, so teams really didn't score a lot against him. So he had good fortune there. It just a couple injuries with Anthony Richardson, a couple other guys. Next year could be a better year for him. So that was Matt. He was in sixth. And then we get the final spot before the playoffs. Titty Biscuits. Pat, 8-7, tied with Jace. He just didn't have the points. It was brutal. Pat, the only guy with a winning record that got outscored, which is crazy to think. That means pretty much when he won by a lot. Or when he won close. And when he lost, he got smoked. But still 8-7, so winning record. And he just misses out based on tiebreakers. He was this close in the last week, like we went over before. But Pat's team was good this year. He winning a lot with the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence, Christian Kirk, Travis Etienne. The first half of the year, Travis Etienne looked like the best running back in football. And speaking of best in football, Pat had the best player in fantasy, maybe other than Christian McCaffrey, for the majority of the season. His name's Tyreek Hill. You know, Tyreek showed you got to take him. Like Tyreek should be drafted ahead of Jefferson. He should be drafted ahead of Chase next year. Tyreek is that good. He's that much of a difference maker. It's just throw it up. I mean, he can get you 30-point games just like that. Shoot, he can get 30-point games in the first half. So Pat was riding Tyreek. He was riding ETN. Devontae Smith did his normal thing where he got hot, you know, in the middle of the season. But unfortunately for Pat, the flex positions really killed him later in the season, and ETN fell off really, really hard. His running backs fell off really, really hard considering he lost Chubb. I mean, Chubb is a monster. I love Nick Chubb. I think he's the best running back in football. When Pat lost him, he was his second round pick. And, you know, losing your second round pick is hard. It's crazy hard, especially when it's a running back and a staple that you think you're going to have the majority of the season. He never quite recovered from that. Like I mentioned before, he tried to trade with Justin to get Aaron Jones to help him out, which was ironic because I remember talking to Justin about that trade. And I could be wrong here, but I told Justin, I said, Justin, Aaron Jones is going to be pretty good the rest of the year when he comes back. I said, maybe try to offer him Mostert because Mostert's gonna get hurt. You know Mostert's gonna get hurt, and he did. And Pat declined the trade for Mostert, and probably regretful for Pat because Mostert ended up staying healthy all year, and Aaron Jones was nothing the whole year. So either way, Pat had a good year. I mean, you had a winning record, so got to be a successful year. But just couldn't get in, couldn't score enough points. So solid year, Patty. Next year, you got this. All right, to the top four, to our playoff matchups. We're going to talk about each team and then the matchup. First matchup we're going to start with is Cass versus Jace. These are the two best teams all year, guys. I know one first place, one fourth place. Jace ends up limping into the playoffs with 3 straight losses. But even with 3 straight losses, Jace still scored the most points of the year this year. And he's playing Cass, who's only lost 4 games all year. This is going to be a hell of a matchup, I think. We're going to talk about Cass real quick, and then we'll talk about Jace. Cass, he's been the man all year. He's 11-4. He beat Jace by 3 games. He beat second place by 2 games. So he knew he was in the playoffs at least 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he's been really, really good. You know, you look at Cass's team. He came out of the draft, and I said his biggest weakness was quarterback. And he's managed to have 2 studs, sometimes 3 studs at quarterback. He has Jordan Love. He has Matthew Stafford. Stafford's been so much better than I thought he was going to be. And Jordan Love, when he has those games, he's awesome. But Cass really needs him to have those games. He used the middle of the year. He rode Gus Edwards in the middle of the year to get a couple victories from them. He has Isaiah Likely and Trey McBride, so he has 2 stud tight ends. Trey McBride, one of the best pickups of the year. He's probably tight end fantasy. If you're going to rank him right now, he's either 1 or 2, depending on where you put Sam Laporta. They're both over Kelsey right now. So Trey McBride, a huge thing. You know, his 3rd round pick, CeeDee Lamb, could be a league winner. The guy's been better than, you know, almost any other wide receiver in the league, other not named Tyreek this year. Maybe A.J. Brown, but CeeDee Lamb's been awesome. Dallas's offense is scoring a lot. You know, and this is all without even mentioning the best player in fantasy, Christian McCaffrey. You know, Cass was sitting at that second spot in the draft. Actually, 3rd spot, because Josh took JJ, and then Cal surprised everyone, and he took Mahomes, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Cass was wondering, do I take a receiver like Jamar Chase here? Do I take Kelsey here? Or do I take the high risk, high reward? And he took the high risk, high reward because Christian McCaffrey is the one guy in fantasy that if you can guarantee a healthy year, you're taking him first no matter what. Because you know if he plays, he's the best. He's basically a receiver and a running back in the same position. As long as he stays healthy. And he stayed healthy all year. Cass is hitting the jackpot. I mean, the dude's he's projected to get 20 points as a running back, which is insane. But he's not the reason Cass is in first place. He's the reason Cass made the playoffs, but he's not the reason he's in first place. The reason he's in the first place is because Cass did a great job. Like I said, McBride. And another thing that he has for him right now, he's rolling, is a guy named Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice is like a top 15 wide receiver right now, going into the playoffs. And Cass has him. So Cass has CeeDee Lamb, he has Rashee Rice, he has Christian McCaffrey, uh, he has Trey McBride, he has all these awesome pass catchers. His flexes are DK and Deontay. They are, I think, the difference between Cass scoring 170 points and Cass scoring, 140 points. Because sometimes those guys are awesome and sometimes those guys lay eggs. Another big X factor is Mr. Horse Turd Hair, Derrick Henry. Um, hasn't looked good. I think last week he had 20 touches for 15 yards, worst game of his career. If Derrick Henry can get it rolling for the playoffs, then Cass will be unstoppable and he will be the Super Bowl champ. But Cass, congrats on your first place regular season. You did awesome this year. Your pickups were great. Your draft was great. You really didn't have any injuries as well. You have deep running backs. You played the game, and your kicker was awesome this year. I really think your kicker put you over the edge this year. So awesome job with the kicker position as well. Next, we're going to talk about his opponent, Jace. Jace's team scored the most points this year. He was incredibly roll on fire for like 5 weeks in the middle of the season. And I mean, it makes sense. His quarterbacks, his first overall pick was Jalen Hurts, and he did awesome this year. Even when the Eagles played bad, he still ended up with 20 points because of rushing. Dak Prescott had a much better year than I thought. He's been awesome this year. Calvin Ridley's had a down year. DeAndre Hopkins has kind of had a down year. Olave's been kind of nicked up. His wide receivers were supposed to be his strength going into the year. And the weird thing was they've kind of been his weakness because he has Olave, he has Diggs, he has Hopkins, he has Calvin Ridley, he has all these studs, Marquise Brown, and they've all been kind of mediocre. At the beginning of the season, they were good. Diggs started out great, Olave was doing good, but they've kind of fallen off. The crazy part about it is his running backs are what his strength is. He has Achane for Miami. He can get 30 points just like that. He has Kamara, who right now Kamara is probably the number 2 running back in fantasy. Other than McCaffrey, you got to start Kamara. I mean, he catches a billion balls, he gets touchdowns, he rushes the ball. And Jerome Ford, he took him to replace Chubb, and he's been pretty solid this year. He has Goddard. He might put in Njoku, so his tight end's pretty good. But, we'll see. Jace, because I mentioned those wide receivers, he's not as strong as he was in the middle of the season. But those 2 quarterbacks, those are going to be a huge difference maybe against Cass because he can get 60 points from his quarterbacks where Cass has Stafford and Love, which that ceiling just isn't as high. But the rest of Cass's roster, honestly, is just better than Jace's. We'll see if Olave plays, but I'm not going to make any predictions on the playoffs. I'm just going to kind of give my thoughts on the teams. It's a really close matchup, especially if you look at projections. Jace needs his quarterbacks to win him this week, unfortunately. He needs a monster game from his 2 QBs. He needs a monster game from Alvin Kamara or Olave in that Saints game. And he needs one of his other guys to go off, I think, for him to have a chance. So we'll see. I don't know how it's going to match up. He has Philly D that he's going to put in. It looks like I don't like starting the defense when you have the quarterback, but we'll see if it works. They're playing the Giants, so that's going to be an awesome matchup. Who knows how it's going to be, but like I said, the top 2 high-scoring teams, very rarely do you get the 2 highest-scoring teams playing in the first round of the playoffs. So going to be an awesome, awesome matchup. Jace, congrats to making the playoffs. Next playoff matchup. What a matchup we got here. Rematch of our Super Bowl last year and our co-Super Bowl champions, Josh versus Llama. Josh ends up 2nd place this year. Llama ends up 3rd place this year, both at 9-6. And Llama kept rolling and Josh kept rolling. We'll start with Josh on this one. Josh ends up having just he gets 2nd place, but, I mentioned all these first-round picks. He didn't have his for the majority of the year. Josh was the only person that did not hit his first-round pick, got hurt majority of the year. Justin Jefferson, he basically missed 9 straight weeks with an injury, but he was pretty deep at wide receiver, so he kept plugging away. And then 2 weeks after losing Justin Jefferson, he loses Kirk Cousins, who at the time was the number 1 fantasy quarterback when he got hurt. So he had some big injuries happen, but he has Goff. He had Kyler on the IR spot. He's been okay for him since he came back, but he invested heavily in the Lions, and a lot of weeks that's a good thing. Goff, Amon-Ra, and Gibbs has really come on the second half of the season. He's such an electric player. Amon-Ra is very, very steady every single week. A big mistake that Josh made that he regrets is he took Davante Adams with his third pick, and he was debating between Davante Adams and CeeDee Lamb. He took Davante. That could cost him the Super Bowl. But we'll see what Davante does during these playoffs. Jake Ferguson's a pretty good tight end, but another big reason that Josh has made the playoffs with this late push was James Cook's come on a lot. They fired their offensive coordinator. They have a different guy that's pounding the ball a little bit more in Buffalo, and James Cook's thriving. If Josh can get similar production from James Cook like he's gotten the last couple weeks, he's going to be pretty tough, especially with his wide receivers. But at the end of the day, Josh's team comes down to the Lions and Justin Jefferson. That's pretty much, I mean, those are the two things. If the Lions play well, if Justin Jefferson does anything like he's supposed to, then Josh has a really good shot to win. We'll see if that happens. Those are big ifs. But Josh did pretty well this year. Nico Collins was a good draft pick. Christian Watson, we'll see if he plays this week. But Josh's team's he has some decisions to make. He doesn't really know who he's going to start. It's also based on who's going to play and who's not going to play. But Josh made it in the playoffs. He ended up second place. And now he gets to play Ryan in a rematch of last year's Super Bowl. Speaking of Ryan had a really good year. I can't remember correctly, but at the beginning of the year, Ryan was dealing with a lot of shit on his team. I mean, he drafted Jonathan Taylor. He had that stupid holdout. Eckler was banged up. So he was dealing with these injuries from his top two picks, two of his top three picks, and then Saquon's kind of had a May year. So Ryan left the draft with by far the best running backs, old school fantasy football draft from like 2007 or something. You pound running backs. And he did it, and he did it with success because he made it to third place. He even had DeAndre Swift as depth. So he had 4 stud running backs, and they all hit for him this year. Now he has a choice to make whether he plays Swift, Barkley, Eckler, or if Jonathan Taylor even plays this week. We'll see. He's still he's still questionable. But the big thing for Ryan, I mentioned Trey McBride for Cass. Sam Laporta has been a monster for Ryan, an absolute monster for Ryan. He's been the #1 fantasy tight end for the last 8 weeks. He won the week almost for Ryan this week on Saturday against Pat. We'll see if Ryan's quarterbacks can give him the points he needs. Justin Fields is extremely boomer bust. He either gets him 27 or he gets him like 10 points. They're playing Arizona D this week, so I love that matchup for Justin Fields. He probably will have a great week. And speaking about Justin Fields' great week, Ryan has DJ Moore, who could benefit. So Ryan could win this week just based on that game alone. If they get a couple TDs from Moore, could push him into the Super Bowl. Russell Wilson's playing New England this week. We'll see. Russell Wilson's actually been pretty decent this year. He somehow gets these rushing touchdowns every single week. But he's been pretty steady for Ryan. But it's mainly about those 3 running backs and Laporta, because his flex spot right now, he has Cole Kmet in there. He's not going to start. He's not going to start Gabe Davis. There's not really any guys on the free agent market, so I think he might be sticking with Cole Kmet. So Ryan has 2 pass catchers from Chicago and Chicago's quarterback. He's kind of all in, as well as Josh is all in with the Lions. So both of these guys are heavily rooting for NFC North teams this week. Brandon Ayuk, he's playing Baltimore. It's on Monday Night Football, so we won't know. I mean, Saquon also plays Monday Night Football. DeAndre Swift plays Monday Night Football. So Ryan has a lot of Monday Night Football games. We're not going to know the outcome of this matchup until after Monday Night Football. But Ryan's team's really good. He did awesome this year. Like I said, he drafted the 3 running backs. It paid off for him. He kept picking up guys. He got maybe the best pick of the year in Sam Laporta. So Ryan looks good. Ryan looks good. It's going to be a hell of a matchup. It's going to be an awesome rematch of our Super Bowl. I mean, you have co-Super Bowl champs facing each other in the first round of the playoffs. So we'll see. And that's it, guys. Those are the 2 matchups in the playoffs. That's kind of a summary of how our league went this year. Hope the video wasn't too long. I know it was almost about a half an hour. Hope you guys stayed with me. I know only a couple of you guys maybe watched these bad boys. But love you guys. It was such an awesome year playing fantasy. We have 2 more weeks. Grats to everyone that made the playoffs. Cass, grats for first place in the regular season. That's seriously a really, really good achievement, regardless of what happens in the playoffs. And yeah, guys, if I don't talk to you guys, I know I'm going to be texting with you guys all week, but since I got you face to face, Merry Christmas. I love you guys. See ya.